So hello, and welcome to the Fisher Library's video podcast series, Between the Pillars. My name is John Shoesmith. I am the outreach librarian here at the Fisher. And I should say this is a very special episode of Between the Pillars, one that I've been looking forward to personally, as we're going outside the usual format this time. Normally what we do is we meet one of the library staffers where we talk about some of our collections. But what we're going to do this time is talk to one of the library's contributors, and an important contributor at that, award-winning author Lawrence Hill, who you can see here, who is with us remotely from his home in Hamilton. So welcome, Larry. I'm so happy that that you can join us.
Thank you so much, John. It's great to be here. It's great to have this conversation.
I'm really looking forward to it. So what I wanted to say is, well, of course, we carry all of Larry's books at the library. We carry the different editions, the translations. What we want to focus on today is archival material, hence why we've titled this Writers and Their Archives. So those that may not know, I'll just fill you in on what the Fisher has. Our archival materials, our archival holdings are pretty vast. We now have up to 700 manuscript collections, and these include some of the country's most important writers: Margaret Atwood, Leonard Cohen, Gwen McEwen, George L.A. Clark, and of course, Lawrence Hill, who first began donating his papers back in 2008. I don't know if you know the size, Larry, of your collection now. It comprises 275 boxes and items. And, or as archivists like to speak, we always talk in terms of size as librarians and archivists. It's 52 meters of material. So it's large. It's one of the larger collections we have, archival collections we have at the Fisher. So actually, we're going to be including my Fisher colleague, Natalie Tan, very shortly, because there is going to be a show and tell component of this as well. We want to show some of the highlights that we think of Larry's papers. But Larry, I wanted to begin by asking you something that I don't even know the answer to. Basically, the process of you donating your materials to the Fisher, was it something that did we approach you? Did you approach us? The only thing I remember, actually, I don't know if you remember this, is a lunch that we had at the Harvard House. I was there, Richard Landon was there, and Jennifer Taves, our manuscript librarian, was there. So that's all I remember. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the process then of how your papers ended up at Fisher.
Oh, so great to remember that you were at that lunch, John.
Yeah.
So yes, basically I was approached initially either by Jennifer Taves or by Richard Landon. And I'm sorry we've lost Richard. He was such a wonderful guy and a real great conversationalist too. So we went out for this eternal lunch that took all afternoon.
Yep.
And I was approached and asked if I'd like to donate my papers. And my father, who's donated his papers partially to the National Archives of Canada and partially to the Ontario Archives, and whose archives I organized before they were donated. My father used to say to us throughout our childhood, "Don't throw out anything. That's family history." And I took that to heart. So I never threw out anything that was like a diary or a letter or a photo. And by the time it was possible to make a donation to the U of T archives, my first wave of donations comprised, if you can believe it, I remember 73 boxes. They came out in the truck to pick them up. There were 73 boxes came to my home at the time in Burlington, Ontario. And it was a lot of work to organize. It drove my kids and wife crazy that, I sort of taken over the house, organizing all these boxes so that it could be taken away. But it was a huge task, and I threw myself into it, and I really tried to organize the papers well before they were donated. So if I had distinct papers about certain drafts of a book, I'd keep them separate. I've had letters from a certain part of my life, I'd keep them separate. If I had correspondence with an editor, I'd keep that separate. So each thing I donated was organized in separate little categories and folders so that a person looking at it and evaluating and figuring out its worth and its interest could at least see what I had without having a whole jumble of mess in front of them. So it was probably a good 2 months of work to get all that stuff sorted and organized thematically. And I even included little notes on top of the distinct sections saying, this is what this is about, and this is what that's about, so that, again, a person looking at it from the outside would quickly understand the significance of whatever it was I had in that box or in that folder.
It kind of makes me curious, actually. So it sounds like you curated the collection a little bit prior to it coming to the Fisher. And I'm wondering if there was a temptation on your part to maybe curate things that you didn't necessarily want to be at the library, whether it's, I often think of a writer can really tailor their legacy in some ways. Let's say they don't give us all the drafts of their work that maybe we think, oh, the first draft was the only draft, or they don't include rejection letters, for example, from past years. Was there any sort of inclination to do that at all?
Believe me, if I can't remember now, but if I found any rejection letters, I definitely would have included them because they're always so interesting
Right.
and they say so much. And I received tons of them, so I'm sure you have a few in there somewhere. Boy, especially that first novel, Some Great Thing. I could have wallpapered in my bathroom with rejection slips. There were so many that came in, and most of them were form letters. So you don't even know, with your first book, especially if your book's even being read when you're getting a form letter back. Sorry,
Right.
this does not correspond to our editorial directive. Did I curate it? Well, for sure. I mean, there were certain personal things I didn't want to go in there, so I just left them out and didn't donate them.
Right.
Um, um, Things that I felt were I was told that very unequivocally by Jennifer and Richard that you were interested not just in sort of professional things like drafts of books, but also if I had letters or photos or personal notes, that those things would be of interest too. It wasn't just sort of purely literary. And so I
Right.
did include a ton of personal things, including, letters to my parents or letters I'd received and that kind of thing. So, but for sure it was curated and I tried to organize it well.
Right.
And frankly, I also tried to organize it well because another friend had advised me that if I organized it well, the antiquarian booksellers who evaluated it would put a bigger dollar sign on it because they sort of see the value of it. And I thought, well, good, I'll get a better tax write-off. So there was a financial motivation too, I must admit.
Oh, what's the dirty little secret of archival donations is the tax receipt component of it.
I don't think that should be a secret. I tell writers all the time who are developing, save your stuff because one day, you may be invited to donate it. And
Mhm.
that's a really great thing to do. And in addition to the beauty of knowing that your work is available in an archives for people to see, you also get a tax credit. And writers, they should know that.
It's funny because when we always run a creative writing gala every year with the University of Toronto's Masters of Creative Writing program, and usually when that's one of the things I always say in my opening statement: make sure you save your papers, make sure that this material is held on to because it does have value, not just as a research component, but it has monetary value down the road as well.
Yes, absolutely, it does, and I say that I say the same thing to writers who need every bit of encouragement they can to sort of, create advantageous situations for themselves financially. It's already a struggle as a writer, so if you can get a tax write-off, why not?
It's interesting to me because obviously, as someone that's relied on library and archives to do research in your book, you've also been a journalist. You must obviously, I hope, appreciate the value of what we as archivists and librarians do. I mean, is that something that you're aware of in terms of your overall knowledge of the archival process, for example?
Well, I'm not an archivist. I'm not going to claim to have an intimate understanding of all the different things that you do in terms of your day-to-day work. I have some idea because I've had many, many conversations over the years with Jennifer Taves, who was
Mhm.
organizing initially my donations to the U of T. So I have some idea of what's involved, but from a writerly standpoint, even if I don't understand all the details of your day-to-day work, I've written 10 books. There's not a single book I could have written without a massive amount of time in libraries and archives. And I rely profoundly on those institutions to, do my research so I have something to write about and some backbone to put, into my work, even if it's fiction,
Right.
even if it's um, fantasy, which I'm working on now for an 11th book. I still need to do research in libraries and archives to make sure that whatever I'm writing about in the fantasy holds up and is has an air of verisimilitude. And
Right.
so I am profoundly grateful to libraries and archives, and I it seems like I've spent half my life in them. In fact, I use them so much that I'm afraid that I might overuse them and not get my work done because the temptation is so great to disappear into the stacks, and they come out at the end of the day and you still got nothing written. And so eventually you have to sort of say, okay, that's enough, like get writing.
It's actually one of the joys too, as people that process this material, is that we ourselves get lost in it at the same time. I mean, obviously we need to take a one step back in terms of, this is the work we're doing, but I mean, in terms of some of the archival stuff that I've processed in the past, I've got very sort of emotionally tied to the writers that whose papers I've worked on in the past. So it's a nice relationship that we can have with a writer, I think.
Yeah, and it's true. And I mean, I know that we've just really begun to talk more recently, John, and I've quite enjoyed that as well as with your colleague Natalia. But I developed a real fondness for Richard as we had a number of conversations in the early stages, and in a real friendship, truly a friendship with Jennifer as she was going over Jennifer Taves as she was going over so deeply the material, and we had many conversations, and it was very edifying and incredibly rich and satisfying. So yes, it's deeply meaningful to me on every level.
You get an intimate relationship, I think. I guess it'd be a good time to bring in Natalia, actually, who will be joining us, because she's going to be showing some of the material that we have here that we're going to be showing. So let's see if I can get her on. There she is.
Hi, Natalia.
Here.
So welcome, Natalia. For those that don't know, Natalie Tan is our processing archivist at the Fisher. She hasn't done all 700 or so manuscript collections, but she does the bulk right now of processing most of the Canadian writers who donate their papers to us. And I think you're going to be working on Larry's next accession. Is that right?
Yes. Your latest donation.
It'll be coming soon.
Coming soon. So thanks, John. So I'm just gonna open this and show a few selected highlights. I guess I do.
So when we have 53 meters or so of material, it was pretty difficult to kind of narrow it down to some of the material. So what we've done, and Natalia especially has chosen some of her favorite materials. Some of which actually was in a recent exhibition that Natalia and I curated last year called Strength in Numbers, the Canlit Community. So it's a lot. Some of the stuff is a lot of fun to look at, I think.
Are some of those boxes mine that you see there?
So actually, this first slide, I wanted to give the viewers a behind the scenes peek at your archives in our basement. So this is your first donation. In our temperature controlled basement safe. Okay, so the first thing I want to look at is some of your earliest correspondence. I mean,
Natalia and I, by the way, were joking about this. I wonder, we think you might be sick of talking about these cat letters, but no, we love them.
I'm not sick of them, and there's some other ones that I think are just as significant, and thank you for bringing them up. And I've been told by you and also by Jennifer Taves in the past that this item of my archival donations has been perhaps more requested than most other items. And it really does say a lot about me and my upbringing, my relationship with my father, and frankly, honestly, without exaggerating, how I became a writer. Because as you can see in these letters, when I wanted stuff as a child, I was required to write for it. I was required to write to my father, who at the time was the director and then chair of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, ultimate bureaucrat. If I wanted stuff, he wanted to get me off his back. So he'd just say, go upstairs and write me a letter. So for my first kitten, I had to write this letter. All my life, you've been very kind to me, but I just want to ask you a few things. May I have a kitten? May it be mine? So I'm sort of, following his demand that I put my request down in paper with a minimum of of spelling mistakes, please, Larry. And if you do give me a letter that's well written with not too many mistakes, I'll give your request due consideration. Those were his words. And so, of course, he didn't really want me to become a novelist. He had in mind much nobler occupations for the children of a Black immigrant to Canada. He wanted us to become professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, but he pretty well turned me into a writer instantaneously, because he would give me the things I generally asked for. And that made me think, well, I'll just write more. And so I just besieged him with every manner of letter, including what's really striking to me when I read them in retrospect. I'd forgotten until I really was shown them again by you and by a friend of mine, a poet and writer in Vancouver. His name is Chantal Gibson, who did a whole conversation with me at Simon Fraser University about these letters. And there's a lot of reproach in these letters. I took my father to task if he was mistreating a cat. It wasn't just to ask for things, but if he was misbehaving or showing some cruelty to my pet, I would just lambaste him in these letters. And looking back, I'm surprised at how frontal and direct I was. And he was a very kind of authoritarian father. And so it was dangerous to confront him too directly, but somehow still I just let loose in these letters. And so you can sort of see them there. If you want to look at one more carefully, we can, but there's one of them in which I give him a hard time for mistreating our cat.
Hmm.
Well, I see one where it says, Cindy doesn't really mean to hurt you. Will you let her have a few more chances?
Yes, and I don't know if there's another one on another page you've got there. I see that one too. Yes, there's that one. I think that might have been one of the first letters I wrote for a cat. Um, and I think I've said, she's 2 months old. She's trained to go to the washroom. She has very good behavior. I think she should be mine. Don't tell anybody else I'm writing this letter, that kind of thing. It's really looking back. But I put all my passion into that letter. And I think I was about 6 or so when I wrote that particular letter that you see there.
Recursive.
So we also have another letter in the same vein that you wrote to your father that involves negotiating your bedtime.
Yeah. And here, like, this is what surprises me in terms of how frontal it is. And I'm not sure, but if I were to guess, I think I might be somewhere around 10 or 11 when I'm writing this letter. And, dear Dad, since I'm not allowed to speak
Freely.
something anger freely, speak and argue freely,
Okay.
although I should be allowed to, I'm forced to put this down on paper. I'm very disgusted about this topic, my bedtime, and I proceed to demand that I should be allowed to stay up until 10 o'clock. And it's unfair that I should be being brought in from playing outside on the street when all my friends still get to play outside. And so, I think it's a reasonable proposition. Talk about the son of a human rights commissioner. If you say yes, if my homework is done, I think that my wishes are highly reasonable and they should be granted, Larry. And so really quite on the nose. And then just look at his response for a second, which is the next letter, which I find equally fascinating. I could think, since he did not take well to being challenged, and I'm sure that my letter angered him. And here he responds, and he's clearly restraining himself, even though he must have felt a measure of irritation at this pestering son. Larry, I feel that men of goodwill should always be able to reason and discuss their differences. I would never wish to squelch your speech if it is done in a polite manner on your part. However, sometimes you carry your discussions too far and then you make a general pest of yourself. And so a little bit of reproach there, but at least he didn't come at me, with a smack or something. And then he grants me a partial victory. So I asked to be able to stay up till 10, and he says I can stay up till 9:45 or something. And so it's a compromise. So I move forward on it. And I just think it's so interesting to see his very sort of cautious response in which he knows he has to show some level of parental reasonableness, even though I'm sure he was quite angry at the tone of my letter, which he would have felt to be, quite disrespectful.
Who would have held on to these? Who would have held on to these
Documenting
letters?
it. He's even putting the time down that he wrote it, October 24th, 11:45 p.m. Underlined as if you are a pain in the ass. You're making me write this letter at midnight, and I've had a busy day at the Human Rights Commission.
So who would you have held on to these letters in terms of would they have traveled with you variously through the years, or were they something that your parents held on to, or?
What happened was I wrote all these letters and they kept them. And then he would write me letters back, which I kept. And then they all went into a box that my parents kept for me for years in their basement, for years.
Right.
And then finally, as I moved into adulthood and was able to sort of live independently, well, I moved out at 17, but once I was living independently and had a place to live that was stable, I just retrieved my documents. It was in a big box called Larry. So all these letters that we'd written back and forth were in this box. It just was called Larry.
Yeah, because we're so fortunate, because so many writers, people that become writers eventually just don't have that foresight that some of this material will be of value down the road. So this is one of the collections, and actually we're fortunate at the Fisher that quite a few of our collections have this, what we call juvenilia, that people have held on to this material over the years.
Well, yes, and for me, in terms of my development, it may be obvious, but I'd like to say anyway that, I'm writing to a recalcitrant person who's sitting with his arms crossed, at the dining room, at the kitchen table saying, you better impress me because I'm not budging unless I'm impressed. So I'm not just writing some arid, heartless, school exercise. I am pouring my heart and my will and my conviction into these letters. So I'm really laying it down in these letters, and I'm learning argumentation and passion, and I'm writing because I know that if I write this well, I'll get something. And so it really turned me into a person who's not just writing, but thinking of an audience, thinking of how to cajole and persuade and bring somebody over to my side. So it was fantastic training as a writer, actually, to have to write these letters.
It's amazing.
And we have many, well, we have quite a few of them in the collection.
This was written when I was in Vancouver. Westbrook Crescent is right across the street from the University of British Columbia. So I went out to UBC for my first 2 years of undergraduate study, and I took creative writing. So on the top right there says CRWR 202. That was the name of the course, Creative Writing 202, Section 4, assignment number 7. I had this story that I spent all night writing. I pulled an all-nighter to get it in on time. And it's about a boy who's upstairs in his room, who's sick, and who, there's not a lot that happens plot-wise, but it's he's sort of absorbed by the sounds of the family downstairs eating and doing things. And even though he can't be with them because he's sick, and even though he can't make out their voices because they're their specific words, because they're a bit too far away, he can hear their voices, and he's absorbed by the rhythm of the family conversations that he hears while he's sick in his room, even though he doesn't make out the words. And even looking back, like I wrote this when I was 18, and I think it's actually a beautiful idea. I was really slipping into interiority of thought and into one's, kind of almost subconscious perceptions of the sound of family. And I think it was a wonderful idea. I'm not saying it was a good story, but it was, I was really trying to slide into an intimate voice, an intimate point of view, deeply inside the perspective of the narrator, the first person narrator. And so I guess in some respects, it's a precursor to, writing a book like the Book of Negroes, where I move deeply into the first person voice of a woman, who becomes Aminata in the Book of Negroes. So I'm just trying to, as you see, I've been reading Hemingway, and so you can probably guess that. I've been reading a lot of Hemingway, and so the sentences are extremely short, head pounding, arms can't push me up, I fall back, tired, close my eyes. But so I was playing around with brevity of sentence because I was, laboring under the belief that if the sentences were shorter, it would represent more accurately the, train of thought and the spinning around inside my head. So I was trying to evoke that. And so it was a really interesting kind of stylistic experimentation for me. I didn't always write like that, but I was writing like that in that story as I was trying to get into really intimate point of view and kind of stream of consciousness. So it's not a particularly good story that I'd really want anybody to read for its achievements in a literary sense, but it's a good representation of my development as a teenager, trying to learn about point of view and interiority of thought. And after all, I feel the richest thing I have to offer as a writer is interiority of thought. It's something that you can't do as much if you're a filmmaker or a playwright, but as a novelist, you can really slide deeply into the thoughts of a character. And so here I was sort of playing around with that piece of my own writing equipment that has become so essential to how I work on the page.
It's funny because so many professional writers, people that become professional writers, tend to feel embarrassed by some of these early efforts. But obviously, you look at it now and you think it's just part of the development.
I'm not embarrassed. It's not a good story, but I'm not embarrassed. I mean, I was just 18 years old and developing, and believe me, this stuff is nowhere near as good as often the things I'm reading as a professor teaching creative writing to undergrads at university in Guelph. And I often tell my students, it's just because you don't think you're where you need to be, doesn't mean you can't get there.
Right.
And it's a process and it takes time. And so I remember to be humble in reading other people's stuff too, especially if they're just beginning their process, because even something that looks completely undeveloped and unformed could easily lead to something quite beautiful 3 or 5 or 10 years later.
And it's great to have these documents too, to kind of track your progress as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I liked this personally because I noticed a few drafts of it in your papers, and I liked the two different parts. So the first part features your family, and the second was completely different. And I kind of liked this little paragraph that I've screenshotted at the bottom, where you're in a library doing research. So books, I hunt them, more material for my essay, books, books hide. Like I kind of liked that because it shows you were always doing maybe extensive research.
Yes, and I see right here, I love this line. I stumble through library, bury myself in stacks in the catalogs. It seems like a lifelong predicament of mine. I can count the number of times I've gone into Robarts Library at the University of Toronto and emerge with like almost too many books to manage in my arms, and then stumbled to a big table and spent like 5 hours going through them all to see which ones would be most useful to me as I was researching some aspect of some book. And so, burying myself in the stacks is very much part of, I think, my lifelong process, even then.
And there were also some critiques of the piece. So it was interesting to see the feedback from others. Kind of difficult to zoom in on the screen, but you had feedback from, I guess, your professor and two other classmates. So
yeah, my professor, he was like one of the most wonderful creative writing professors I've ever had. He passed away some years ago. His name was Douglas Bankson. He was particularly adept and known for writing radio plays, which is almost a dying breed of literature these days. He wrote a lot of radio plays for the CBC. He lived in Vancouver. And every time I read a story and submit it, he'd write me this single-spaced, typed on this yellow paper response, which was so engaged, and he took me seriously, even though I'm sure I was writing crap. He took me seriously, and he engaged with me, and he'd write me these letters, and I really have modeled my own response to creative writers whom I'm teaching or mentoring after the support I got from Doug Bankson way back in '75. And so I write a very thoughtful letter to students too when they submit something, and the letter includes a lot of general comments, and then I'll go right into the nitty-gritty line by line comments on the manuscript itself. And so I've really done the same sort of thing with my students that Douglas Bankson did for me. And so he inspired me, not just to be a serious writer, but also to be a really authentic and engaged teacher.
So now we're going to switch the conversation, and we're going to talk about some highlights or show some highlights from the Book of Negroes, or alternatively titled Someone Knows My Name in the United States and Allnighter in France.
Yes. Well, Allnighter was actually my suggestion for the French title of the book. I speak French, fluently, and went to a French university and have lived in France and Quebec and in French West Africa. And, many French novels use as a title the name of the protagonist. Is not at all uncommon in French literature. And I just didn't feel that there was a good translation of the Book of Negroes. For one thing, book, has so many different registers in the English language. I don't think you get as many in French. Livre, in French doesn't quite do it the way book does in English, because book, it could be a kind of a biblical reference, like the Book of Exodus, or it could be a ledger. Book in English can be a lot of things, but livre is a bit more, I think, pedestrian. And Negroes is actually quite hard to translate well into French. There are words that kind of get to it, but they don't get to it well, because English has such a weird and sick and detailed variation of racial terminology for Black people, and there's not a really good translation in French of the word Negroes. You can get at it, but not quite as well. And so I just didn't feel that we'd succeed in translating directly a literal translation, of the title in French. And so I was the one who was advocating with my publishers in France and in Quebec that we should instead of trying to do a direct translation, which I thought would fall flat, to use Aminata instead. So that explains the French title, and I was glad they went for it. As for the American title and the one used in Australia and New Zealand, they were sort of forced on me. The title change was forced on me by the American and Australian publishers. And so they had proposed a title which I really didn't like. And so I just bartered and finally got them to agree that I'd come up with a different title than the Book of Negroes. So it became Someone Knows My Name. A long story there, but as it turns out, the novel was republished in the States as the Book of Negroes after the miniseries came out in the States with the name The Book of Negroes. So the publisher felt that they then had license to reissue the book under the original Canadian title.
Great. So within the collection, there is obviously extensive research and many, many notebooks for the novel, which document various aspects, including character and plot points, as well as your preliminary research. So this notebook I liked, and I'm showing because here you've written out who your protagonist is going to be. So you've written out Aminata Diallo is an African woman who returns to Africa a free woman. So I liked that here you can kind of see the process. So in this, I have a question. So can you talk a bit about your writing process for this book and the length of time between doing all of this research and writing?
Well, the length of time was for the entire book was about 5 years, and I was doing everything all simultaneously, researching and plotting and making notes and writing. So I was doing them all jumbled up, which is sort of the way I like to work, because I'm sure if I decided just to research first, I'd probably still be researching today and still wouldn't feel I had enough to write the novel. So you sort of have to get going with the writing, even as you do carry out the research. And one of the ways that I kind of try to advance my thoughts, the most effective way is just to write. And it seems to be the way that I find my way best is to write. But then as I've written some stuff, then I go back onto the paper with my pen and paper, and I just try to plot out things and think about things. What am I going to do? And who's the person going to be? And what's going to happen to her? And I actually try to tell myself, sort of key messages that I need to incorporate. Messages, I don't mean to the reader, but messages to myself. Like, Larry, this is a story about a woman who wants to go back home, who's taken from her home and she wants to go back. And so for me, all those kind of plotting exercises are ways that just try to get my head around the story. And it was so damn big that I had to do a lot of that plotting and then writing just to find my way and to get my head around a story that was really quite massive.
Oh yes, so this is these are the first pages written for the Book of Negroes.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for writing that on the manuscript, so we all know.
Thank
you. Thank you. So that says first take October 15th. I know I had done something earlier, so I'm not sure. First, maybe I was trying to formalize something that I tried earlier and giving it a run here, but it clearly didn't end up being the way I wrote the novel. In this particular take from 2003, I'm writing in the third person. Crossing water had never made life better for her and always made it worse. And I don't have the name for my character yet. For now, I'm calling her Anna Marie Peterson, who'd taken up the African name Malagawi later in life. And so I didn't really know yet how to tell the story, that it should be written in the first person as if it were a slave narrative, but a fictionalized slave narrative. I hadn't quite found that yet. And I guess the point of showing this first take from this early draft is that I didn't yet know what I was doing. And which is always the way for me. And so I'm writing to sort of find my way to figure out what I'm doing. So it was necessary to lay this down just so I could realize it wasn't working and I should find another way to tell this story. So, and then here, this is some early drafting from January of that same year, 2003. And thank you for pointing this out to me earlier, Natalia. So down there near the bottom of that page 1, it says start novel with this line, seem to have trouble dying. And that is indeed what becomes finally the first line of the novel. So at least I found something, even though most of that stuff was thrown out and never used. I found the first line of the novel in that very early drafting. And often, again, that's what it's all about. You're just throwing stuff down to see where you are, what you've got, what you can work with later. And for me, the best way to find the story is to just draft. And even if 90% of it is thrown out, it might lead me to an answer or to a first line of the novel or something.
Well, it's a very memorable, powerful line. So,
yeah.
So, I mean, there are many, many drafts in your archives, including, I guess this one's a little bit difficult to see, but including drafts that are marked up by your various readers. So this one, I think, is Iris Tupholme's edits.
Yes, Iris Tupholme it basically runs HarperCollins Canada and is, I guess, executive vice president, I believe is her title. But in addition to her worldly duties, running HarperCollins Canada, she's also my editor at HarperCollins and has been since 1997 when they published my second novel, which was called Any Known Blood. So we've worked together now for quite some time. And these are some of Iris's handwritten notes. I basically wrote about 8 drafts of that book. And so I'm not sure 2006 draft. I'm not sure. I mean, I finally finished in 2006. I was getting close because the novel came out in January 2007. So I'm not far from a final here if it's 2006. And anyway, I wasn't showing anything to Iris until I was getting close to being ready. So these are just notes. Iris works on a structural level. So she doesn't so much mess around with, this is a lousy sentence, fix it, find a way to rewrite the sentence. Her comments are at a more structural level. Like, I'm not so convinced by the voice here, or maybe you've left out a bridge that you need to make the transition between this chapter and that chapter more seamless, that kind of thing. So Iris weighs in. It's kind of big picture structural level. And of course, she's the first person I'm working with because she's the most influential. And after that, the edits become more and more specific and detailed. Like, this line is poorly written. Do you want to give it another run? That kind of thing.
Great.
Buddy's War Letters.
Yes, Buddy's War Letters. So this is something you actually asked about earlier in the fall. I scanned some of these for you.
Thank you. It's really, this is, I think, one of the most fascinating little things I did as a younger person. Let's see now, 1980. So when I was 23 in 1980, I gave my father a special Christmas present. I didn't have any money, but I spent weeks and weeks creating this Christmas present for him. And basically, he had told me, don't throw out any of your letters, don't throw out your things, it's family history. And I took him at his word. And when I was 17, I went to visit my grandmother, his mother, African-American woman named May Edwards Hill in Washington, D.C. And I was rummaging through her spare rooms, looking for anything of family history interest that I might find. And I had her permission. I wasn't like rummaging behind her back. And I found these letters that my father had written. All these letters that he'd written when he was in the war, Second World War, as an African-American soldier. I discovered that he was previously married, something he'd never told me, and I came home and confronted him with this. He was furious that I had confronted him with this when I was 17 or so, but I had incontrovertible evidence. I had his letters describing his first wife and, why didn't you tell me this? And did you have children and all this kind of stuff? And later, I took all these letters years later, and I typed them up for him. All of the letters he wrote to his family when he was, in the U.S. Army during the Second World War. And I just found them fascinating for his diction and the sorts of things he had to say and the things that were in his mind and the details, the affection, and even how much income tax he had to pay. I have to pay $149 income tax, that kind of thing. And so some of them are, one of them was written, I think, just after Pearl Harbor was bombed, which was fascinating to read. And so I typed up all of his letters, every one of them, and bound them and gave them to him as a Christmas present. He wasn't ready for that. it kind of angered him. I think it reminded him of his own mortality, and he wasn't ready to be confronted with that. And the letters also contained failure because he'd been kicked out of officer training school, which he desperately wanted to get into because he failed some mathematics tests, and so there were things in the letters that were embarrassing to him because they referred to failures that he'd encountered in his own life, in the army. And for a Black man, being made an officer was like incredibly significant, and for him to have failed in that venture was deeply humiliating. And so I don't think he was happy to see that transcribed in a letter that I did.
I want to wrap this up, Larry, by asking you sort of a question I like to ask everybody. A lot of people that donate their archives is when you think about scholars or researchers using your material, either now or in the future. I mean, what do you hope people really get from them? Do you want them to find more about you as a person, as a writer? I mean, what do you ultimately hope with people going through your archives?
What an interesting question. I've never
been given thought to, I wonder.
I've never really formulated an answer to myself saying, I hope they find out how I moved from draft 4 to draft 5 in a certain book. No, I don't think like that. And it's not like I walk around thinking, well, I hope they read my letters to my father. I hope that they find those things. I don't sort of walk around with a kind of prefabricated notion of what I hope somebody will discover. I guess what I would hope is that somebody who's interested in either my literature or in Black literature or in Canadian history or Black Canadian history or human rights or any of the things that sort of crop up in my work, I hope that it would give a researcher any number of angles that they could explore if they wanted to get at these things. And so I don't have a certain researcher in mind or a certain project that I hope that this work would support. I just like to think that, down the road, people will have access to my work and my aspects of my intimate life and be able to formulate their own, hypotheses about and beliefs about Canada and our literature and our history and the racism in this country. And so I don't actually have a kind of a crystallized idea of what I hope any given person would derive from it. But I just know that I've donated a lot. So there is quite a lot of material to support any number of avenues of research.
I'd say that your future biographer certainly has the reams of material to work with, so which is great. Anyway, you've been very generous with your time, Larry. I really appreciate this. For those that want to look at Larry's papers, all the finding aids are online. Obviously, we're closed right now during the pandemic, but we will be reopening, hopefully sometime in the summer, maybe in the fall. And your papers are great because there's nothing under restriction, which is what we'd like our donors to do. So basically, anything that Larry has donated over the years is available to scholars and researchers. So thanks again for your time. Thank you, Natalia, as well. We'll be having another podcast in 2 weeks' time, which actually had been another archival theme to it. It's going to be about the archives of regular people. So please join us for that. So again, Larry, thanks for your time, and we hope to see everybody soon. Thanks.
John and Natalia, thank you so much. It's been an honor to do this, and it's an honor for me that you have my papers and are taking such good care of them. I hope we'll have a chance to say hello in person one day soon.
Me too. Thanks again, Larry.
Thank you.
Take care.